July 23, 1945. Submerged, cruising stealthily beneath the churning, cold expanse of the Sea of Okhotsk, north of Japan. The only sound is the rhythmic, metallic ping, ping of the sonar, a mechanical heartbeat against the crushing silence of the deep. Inside the control room of the USS Barb, the air is thick, stale, and hot, smelling of diesel, sweat, and frying onions from the galley. The walls, festooned with depth gauges, valve wheels, and circuit panels, feel impossibly close. For the crew of the Barb, this was the twilight of the war, but it was also the high noon of their extraordinary mission. They were part of a coordinated wolf pack, but their commander, Lieutenant Commander Eugene B. Fluckey, had a reputation for operating outside the lines, pushing the limits of the submarine war in ways that were frankly audacious. Fluckey, a man whose intense focus was only matched by his daring, stood hunched over a chart table slick with condensation. He wasn't just sinking ships anymore, he was destroying everything. In the last few weeks, the Barb had run an unprecedented campaign of terror along the Japanese coast, rocketing coastal towns, sinking convoys, and generally acting like a rogue surface ship that could disappear at will. He'd even pioneered the use of the sub's deck gun in close-quarters shore bombardment, a tactic unheard of for a sub-commander. But tonight, he was contemplating something that made even his grizzled veterans raise an eyebrow: ground combat. The target: Sakhalin Island, a long, frost-bitten sliver of Japanese-held territory dividing the Sea of Okhotsk and the Sea of Japan. Specifically, the heavily trafficked railroad line running down the coast, a vital artery moving military supplies and troop reinforcements southward to the Japanese mainland, where the final, bloody invasion was surely coming. Through the periscope's lens, a distorted, wavering picture confirmed the setup: a single-track rail line hugging the shore, backed by dense forest and rocky terrain. The train traffic was predictable, often timed to the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. Barb's mission was to interdict, but Fluckey's mind worked differently. He wasn't satisfied with simply launching a torpedo at a train passing a coastal bridge, a near-impossible shot. He wanted to destroy the rail line from the inside, a surgical strike that would send a clear, terrifying message to the Japanese High Command. Nowhere was safe, not even the Imperial Home Islands. The thought crystallized into a plan so bold it skirted the edge of outright madness. They wouldn't just use their torpedoes or their deck gun. They were going to land a shore party, a small, highly trained commando squad, to place an explosive charge directly on the track. This was uncharted territory. Never before had an American submarine landed a team for ground combat on the Japanese home islands. Gathering his most trusted men, Fluckey laid out the plan with the calm, matter-of-fact certainty that had earned him the nickname, the Galloping Ghost of the Japanese Coast. He needed 8 volunteers, men who could handle explosives, navigate in the dark, and fight hand-to-hand if necessary. The danger was immense. Getting ashore involved paddling an inflatable rubber boat, a rubber ducky, through freezing, choppy water. They would be landing in an area patrolled by Japanese sentries, with no possibility of immediate fire support. If they were captured, they would be executed as spies. Yet, when the call for volunteers went out, nearly every man on the Barb stepped forward. Fluckey picked his crew carefully. Chief among them was Engineman First Class Billy Hatfield, a brilliant, quiet tinkerer who specialized in explosives, and Lieutenant William M.O. Walker, the sharp-eyed assistant approach officer, who would lead the team. They were the key. Hatfield wasn't just going to plant a simple bomb. He was going to invent one on the spot. A device triggered by the train itself. An ingenious, deadly tripwire. The objective was set: infiltrate, plant the charge, blow the tracks, destroy the train, and return, all before the first light of dawn. The weight of history was settling upon their shoulders, though none of them knew it yet. This single, insane mission would soon earn the Barb a unique and lasting place in the annals of naval warfare. The clock was ticking toward their midnight appointment with destiny. The preparations aboard the USS Barb were meticulous, conducted with the hushed urgency of men bracing for an almost impossible infiltration. While the sub quietly crept into the shallow waters just off the coast of Sakhalin Island, the 8 volunteers, the landing party, were finalizing their gear. Lieutenant William Walker, leading the group, checked the 8.45 caliber pistols and the 3 grease-gun submachine guns. They were going in light, prioritizing silence and speed over heavy firepower. Each man carried care rations, a trench knife, and extra magazines. But the centerpiece of the operation wasn't the weaponry. It was the payload. Engineman First Class Billy Hatfield was hunched over his improvised laboratory, a corner of the torpedo room. His task was to rig enough C2 explosive, a potent plastic compound, to guarantee the destruction of a locomotive and several train cars. The real challenge, however, was the trigger. Fluckey needed a device that would detonate precisely when the train passed over it, giving the saboteurs a clean, safe getaway. Hatfield, resourceful and mechanically brilliant, was creating history's first and only known submarine-launched, train-triggered demolition charge. He cannibalized a microswitch from the Barb's own electrical spares, a tiny, sensitive button typically used to activate minor control circuits. This microswitch was taped to a small wooden block and wired directly into the heavy block of C2. The theory was simple. The sheer weight of a passing locomotive crushing the switch under the rail would complete the electrical circuit, setting off the detonator and tearing the tracks apart. It was a crude, brilliant, and utterly necessary piece of field engineering. As midnight approached, the Barb surfaced slowly, the metallic groan of her ballast tanks protesting against the rising. The sea air, frigid and damp, rushed into the sub's hull. The volunteers, clad in dark fatigues and stripped of all identifying insignia, climbed onto the cramped bridge. The Japanese coast was a dark, intimidating mass, illuminated only by a sliver of moon struggling through the clouds. The sound of waves crashing on the beach was the only constant noise, a perfect cover for their movements. 2 7-man rubber boats, the rubber duckies, were inflated and carefully lowered into the water. Signalman First Class Paul Saunders and motor machinist, Mate First Class Lawrence Newberg paddled one boat. Walker, Hatfield, and the others took the second. Their launch was silent, professional, and terrifyingly lonely. The Barb's silhouette, massive and reassuring, slowly diminished into the inky blackness as they paddled toward the hostile shore. The paddle stroke had to be strong but silent, masking the low, rhythmic squeak of the rubber boat against the water. The landing itself, near the small town of Cashaho, was treacherous. The waves were rougher than anticipated, surging against the rocky shoreline. Once ashore, they quickly hauled the boats past the tide line and hid them under thick brush, their backs to the endless, unforgiving Pacific. Seaman First Class James, Buck Fahey, and electricians, Mate First Class Francis, Severs secured the perimeter, their eyes scanning the dark, tree-lined ridge where the railroad ran. The silence on shore was overwhelming, broken only by the wind whispering through the pines and the distant, unseen call of a bird. Every rustle of a leaf sounded like a shout. The tension was palpable. They were 8 American sailors, deep behind enemy lines, essentially invisible but completely exposed. Lieutenant Walker used his compass and confirmed their location. The rail line was just 200 yards inland, situated on a low embankment. They advanced cautiously, moving in a tight wedge formation, their boots crunching on the loose gravel and pine needles. When they finally reached the tracks, they found them exactly as Fluckey's periscope survey had suggested. Solid steel rails bolted to heavy wooden sleepers. The perfect target. Hatfield immediately got to work. He selected a stretch of track where the embankment was steep, maximizing the effect of the blast. With the other men keeping watch for the telltale glint of a passing lantern or the distant sound of an engine, Hatfield cleared the gravel ballast from under the rail. He had to be quick, precise, and sure. The fate of the mission, the lives of his 7 comrades, and the Barb's unique place in history rested on the proper positioning of that tiny, salvaged microswitch and the meticulously wired charge. Engineman Hatfield worked with the focused intensity of a surgeon, fully illuminated only by the faint, filtered moonlight. He carefully chiseled away the hard-packed gravel, known as ballast, beneath the northern rail. The charge itself was a significant block of C2 plastic explosive, dense and putty-like, which he shaped to fit snugly under the rail base. This placement was critical. The blast needed to sever the steel track completely and simultaneously lift the ties, derailing the train instantly and catastrophically. The fuse leading from the charge was a simple short wire, ending in the microswitch he had salvaged from the submarine spares. This switch, taped to a small, thin piece of wood, had to sit perfectly upright so the weight of the train would compress it, completing the circuit. Hatfield buried the charge and the switch, meticulously replacing the gravel around the rail, taking care not to put too much pressure on the switch while making the disturbed area look as natural as possible. He tested the wire connections one final time with a small, handheld continuity tester. A flicker of a tiny light confirmed the device was armed and waiting. The process took barely 15 minutes, a testament to his expertise under unimaginable pressure. He was planting a landmine that required a locomotive, not a boot, to activate it. The moment of truth, however, now shifted from action to agonizing inaction. Lieutenant Walker pulled the team back approximately 50 yards into the thick cover of the pine forest bordering the track. They formed a tight, silent observation post. The time was just past 1 a.m., July 23, 1945. The air was cold, causing their breath to plume lightly in the darkness. The silence returned, now amplified by the anticipation. Electricians Mate Sever and Seaman Fahey kept their grease guns ready, covering the eastern and western approaches of the tracks. Every man strained his ears for the sound of the approaching train. They knew, based on the Barb's intelligence, that the supply run was due any time between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. Waiting was the hardest part. The constant dread was that a Japanese patrol, a routine track maintenance crew, or a security patrol would stumble upon them or, worse, discover the barely concealed charge. Minutes crawled by, each one stretching into an eternity. The damp earth, the incessant buzz of unseen insects, and the distant, muffled roar of the ocean were the only interruptions to their internal tension. Suddenly, Chief Torpedo Man's mate Kenton Rexford, positioned slightly higher on the embankment, raised a hand, a silent, imperative warning. They dropped instantly, melting into the shadows. Not a train, but a threat far more immediate. The sound of marching boots and clipped Japanese voices. A patrol of at least 4 Japanese soldiers, carrying rifles, was moving along the track heading south, directly toward their position and directly over the planted charge. The air froze. The landing party held their breath, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The patrol passed within feet of the explosive device, their boots thudding rhythmically on the sleepers. Had one soldier paused, bent down, or even casually kicked the ballast, the entire mission and their lives would have been instantly forfeit. The saboteurs watched, pistols raised, ready to open fire if discovered, knowing a firefight would doom their extraction. The patrol marched on, oblivious to the history lying beneath their feet, their voices slowly fading into the southern distance. Walker waited 5 full minutes after the sounds vanished, ensuring the patrol hadn't left a rear guard. The scare was a harsh reminder of their vulnerability. They had penetrated the Japanese homeland, and the enemy was literally walking over their trap. Walker exchanged a tight, silent look with Hatfield, a nod of grim understanding. The risk was worth the payoff. Just as the anxiety began to build toward unbearable levels, they heard it, a low, resonant whistle in the distance, followed by the unmistakable, rhythmic chuffing sound of a steam locomotive fighting its way up the coastal grade. The train was coming. The trap was sprung. The 8 men tightened their grips on their weapons and prepared to witness a spectacle unprecedented in submarine warfare. Just as the anxiety began to build toward unbearable levels, they heard it, a low, resonant whistle in the distance, followed by the unmistakable, rhythmic chuffing sound of a steam locomotive fighting its way up the coastal grade. The train was coming. The trap was sprung. The 8 men tightened their grips on their weapons and prepared to witness a spectacle unprecedented in submarine warfare. The chuffing grew steadily louder, the sound echoing off the dense pine forests and the water, growing from a distant murmur to an overwhelming, metallic roar. The steam locomotive, a massive, powerful black beast, materialized from the darkness, its single headlight cutting a blinding cone through the night. The train was traveling quickly, carrying significant momentum. As it drew closer, the saboteurs could make out the cargo. Flat cars loaded high with crates, cover trucks, and what appeared to be field artillery components, a military supply train, precisely the target they had sought. The 8 men lay motionless, pressed flat against the cold earth, their eyes glued to the track. The locomotive thundered past their hiding place. Lieutenant Walker counted the cars. 10, 12, 15, all moving vital war material toward the Japanese mainland defenses. The very front wheels of the locomotive, the heaviest part of the entire train, rolled directly over the carefully concealed section of track. The enormous weight of the engine bore down upon the rail, forcing the steel momentarily downward. The rail, in turn, crushed the small, delicate microswitch placed by Hatfield. The resulting explosion was instantaneous, violent, and deafening. It was not the muffled thump of a depth charge, but a sharp, shattering crack. The sound of high explosives venting their fury directly upwards, magnified by the metal of the tracks. A geyser of fire, rock, and shredded steel erupted from the railbed. The blast violently severed both rails and ripped the wooden ties to splinters, creating a massive, ragged void in the track. The immediate effect on the locomotive was catastrophic. With the tracks suddenly gone beneath its forward driving wheels, the heavy, fast-moving engine plunged instantly into the shattered ballast. The locomotive's forward motion became a destructive, uncontrolled force. It pitched violently off the embankment, twisting onto its side. The massive boiler burst open, venting scalding steam and smoke in thick clouds. The engine car, momentarily airborne, slammed down into the embankment with a terrifying screech of tortured metal, digging deep into the earth. The cars immediately behind the engine did not fare any better. Traveling at speed, they violently piled into the wreckage of the locomotive, a horrifying cascade of crushing steel and splintering wood. The sound was a symphony of destruction, grinding metal, shattering glass, and the loud, cracking reports of the train's structural integrity failing under the impossible stress. One flat car, loaded with crates, buckled completely, its cargo tumbling down the steep embankment. Secondary explosions began almost immediately as the blast ruptured the locomotive's fuel lines and perhaps ignited some of the volatile military stores. Flames, yellow and hungry, began to lick skyward from the crushed wreckage. Walker allowed himself a single, tight grin in the dark. "That ought to hold them," he muttered to the men closest to him. The destruction was complete and total. The lead engine was hopelessly crippled, the tracks were annihilated, and the subsequent rail cars were a jumbled, burning ruin. They had done it. They had sunk a train. Now came the most dangerous phase, extraction. The sound of the explosion would have been heard for miles, certainly by the earlier Japanese patrol. The landing party could not linger. They rose instantly, moving quickly but silently back through the pine brush, their mission accomplished, but their peril now at its peak. As they moved toward the hidden rubber boats, they cast a final glance back. The raging fire, now fully illuminating the wreckage, was a defiant beacon on the Japanese home islands, a symbol of the Barb's unparalleled audacity and the final weeks of the Pacific War. Their escape had to be flawless, or their heroic act would become a suicide mission. The sound of the train wreck and the ensuing fire was a magnet for the enemy, forcing Lieutenant Walker and his 7 saboteurs into a desperate, rapid retreat. They navigated the few hundred yards back to the beach with professional speed, their senses heightened to every twig snap and distant shout. They were anticipating organized resistance or a counterattack at any moment, especially from the patrol they had narrowly avoided earlier. Chief Torpedo Man's mate Rexford and Signalman Saunders acted as the point and rear guards, their eyes constantly sweeping the tree line. They reached the hidden rubber boats exactly where they had left them, concealed beneath the low-hanging scrub. The adrenaline pumping through them lent them incredible strength, allowing them to launch the heavy boats into the churning surf with minimal noise. The sea, though cold, offered the best chance of survival. Once in the water, they dug their paddles deep, driving the fragile craft through the choppy waves toward the prearranged rendezvous point, a kilometer offshore. Behind them, The glow of the fire marked their success, but also illuminated the extreme danger they were escaping. They could hear the faint, high-pitched urgency of Japanese voices and the distant sound of vehicle engines being started. The pursuit was beginning. Aboard the USS Barb, Commander Fluckey and the remaining crew were on edge. Fluckey, stationed in the control room, had counted the seconds since the massive, satisfying concussion had rattled the Barb's hull. The anxiety of commanding an operation with men on hostile soil was immense. He was listening not just for the sound of their return, but also for the telltale ping of enemy patrol boats or the low drone of a Japanese aircraft. The fate of his team lay entirely in their hands and the skill of his lookouts. Suddenly, a voice on the radio crackled with relief. "Barb, this is Landing Party 1. 8 wet sailors inbound. Mission success. We are clear of the beach." Fluckey did not wait for the formalities. He ordered the main ballast tanks flooded and the sub submerged partially, a broaching position, ready to effect the immediate recovery. The 2 rubber duckies soon appeared alongside the massive hull of a submarine, bobbing precariously in the rough water. The 8 men were hauled aboard one by one, their faces grimed with dirt and their clothes soaked, but every man was accounted for. Engineman Hatfield was the last man off the rubber boat, his hand scratched, but his mission flawlessly executed. The 8 men were back. The time ashore, less than 2 hours. With the rubber boats deflated and stowed and the hatch secured, Commander Fluckey gave the order. "Take her deep. All ahead flank." The Barb immediately angled down, the roar of the engines filling the boat as they plunged beneath the surface, leaving the chaos they had created on Sakhalin Island behind them. The locomotive, the cars, the supplies, and the tracks themselves were destroyed. The unique mission of July 23, 1945, was over. The Japanese had been hit where they believed they were safest, on the home islands, by a ground force landed from a submarine. The record books were instantly rewritten. The USS Barb became the only submarine in the history of naval warfare to sink a train, a testament to the unparalleled audacity of Eugene Fluckey and the extraordinary courage and ingenuity of his 8-man shore party. It remains the only documented U.S. ground combat operation on the Japanese home islands during the entire Pacific War. It was an act of extreme, calculated risk that delivered an enormous psychological blow to the reeling Japanese empire, proving that even their interior infrastructure was now vulnerable to the long reach of the American forces. The war would end less than a month later, but the legend of the Barb and the night they blew up a train would forever remain a spectacular, almost unbelievable footnote in World War II history.